Working at speeds that are hardly imaginable, and on technologies that will sustain us for generations to come. From the smallest possible scales to the expanse of our solar system and the depths of our oceans, connecting the world around us and to one another. For more than 75 years, SRI has had a profound impact on virtually every one of our lives, creating and delivering transformative technologies that have kept us healthier, safer, and more secure. Groundbreaking innovations and ideas that have enriched all of our lives. At home, at work, at school, and at play. From our home in the heart of Silicon Valley and our offices and labs throughout the United States and in Japan, we invite you to learn about SRI's rich legacy of innovation as we continue to lean toward the future, discovering and developing the next generation of transformative technologies, services, products, and ideas, bringing the extraordinary to reality, and defining the endless possibilities ahead.
Hello, and welcome to PARC Forum. My name is Mike Friedman. I'm the Vice President of Communications here at SRI. We are very, very pleased to have you all here this evening. And to those of you who are here online and if in the overflow room, welcome to you as well. I do want to let you know that in the unlikely event of a natural emergency or natural disaster, you should plan to leave the building just in the same way that you came in through those back doors. PARC Forum was established in 1977 as PARC's invited speaker series and public platform for exchanging insights and ideas and building relationships with leading experts in a variety of areas. Speakers have included Nobel Prize laureates, CEOs, and industry leaders, journalists, and other personalities. Just to give you an idea of the diverse array of people who have spoken at PARC Forum over the years, we've had people talking about funding innovation for underfunded diseases, national security, diplomacy, and entrepreneurship, the brand journey of Aston Martin, the future of planetary exploration, and high-tech chocolate. Another night we'll have that again. PARC Forum was put on hiatus actually in 2019, and we're now very pleased to relaunch this series that brings together some of the world's most interesting people for conversations at the intersection of business, technology, and society. When you walked in this evening, you should have received a pencil and a card with an SRI innovation on it. If you have questions you'd like to pose, please write it down on that card, and we'll come through the aisles periodically to collect them and curate them and ask them of the guests. If you want to put your name on the card, that's fine too, and we can read it along with the question, and your affiliation would be helpful as well. And we will also, if there are people in the overflow room, we'll be coming into the overflow room and bringing the questions to me in that way. Now I'm very pleased to introduce our CEO, David PARC, for some introductory remarks. And again, welcome.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome to everyone. Delighted that you're here. We're excited to be relaunching PARC Forum. When you think about SRI, I think many of you, particularly here in the Bay Area, know of it. So you know we were founded in 1946 as Stanford Research Institute, and then in 1970 spun out as an independent nonprofit to do the work of doing research for the public good, to do things for the betterment of mankind, to think about what we can do to be catalysts for economic growth in the region and even beyond. In 1987, the David Sarnoff Labs in Princeton, through a transaction donation from General Electric, were made part of SRI as well. And as many of you also are aware, just a year ago this month, PARC joined the SRI family. And so when you think about that, SRI, Sarnoff, PARC all together, responsible for many of the innovations we enjoy and depend on today. In fact, I would guess that in any given week, probably many of you touch at least 20 things. So if you think about anything from Siri, Nuance, robotic surgery, Ethernet, internet, things related to the personal computer. And I've heard we've been involved in things related to cleaners that are used for laundry. One day, I know everyone wants us to provide the robot folding laundry machine that'll do that. GPS, first mobile robot, the algorithms used for that are still used today in route planning. And then color television. I was checking the weather earlier, as many of you were, the very first meteorological satellite from this group as well. In fact, major, major innovations. And the question we often get asked is, what's next? What's interesting about these others is they're ones born out of public investment that the team here, innovators, said, what can we do that can make an impact on the world? And often at the time it was invented, it was hard to know what the impact would be later. Today, we're very focused on things related to quantum, things related to sensing that enable us to make advances in ways that were not possible before. Precision medicine, being able to deliver the treatment that's needed to the right cell in the body at the right dosage at the right time and not to anything else. Being able to do things that fundamentally reshape, and as we think about the future of work and education and life itself, being able to provide trusted AI that can be the foundation of that. In fact, that's sort of very much a part of our history and our passion, is doing things for the public good. And again, being an independent nonprofit enables us to do that. 1,600 people around all our different locations, including Tokyo, Japan, where we've been there for over 60 years, partnering with government and companies there. And then also, it's a place where, as we continue to do that, we're thinking about what we can do to continue to innovate for the future that we'll look back on. I'm pleased as we launch this to have David Leonhardt be our first guest. We had some delightful conversations ahead of time. Probably don't need to introduce him to many of you. As I understand it, he has a few people that read his column. I think it's up to 17 million or more now. And as you know, and let me make sure I get this right as I read it in terms of his own background. We were commenting earlier about we both have history in Connecticut. He's a graduate of Yale. I had lived in the Connecticut area for many years when leading research globally for United Technologies. But David is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer and editor at the New York Times. And he writes The Morning, as I'm sure many of you follow, the flagship daily newsletter, which is the one with over 17 million subscribers. He's the author of a book that we're discussing today. Ours Was the Shining Future. Provocative title with just one little verb that we'll be talking about. It's the story of the American dream. It was named by the Atlantic, Financial Times, and the New Republic as one of the best books of the year. Previously at the Times, David was an op-ed columnist, the Washington bureau chief, a Times Magazine staff writer, podcast host, and founding editor of the Upshot section. He also led a strategy group that helped the Times leadership shape the newsroom's digital future. He previously worked at Business Week magazine and the Washington Post. I'm sure if you catch up with us later at the reception, you'll find out what a fan he is of women's basketball. We're just talking about March Madness and things of that fashion. I'm going to invite David to come up and make some remarks, and then I'm going to join him in the front. We'll chat and also take questions from all of you as we think about the American dream, where it is, where it's headed, what we can do about it. So David, please.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me here. Thank you, Mike, for having the idea to do this. It's such an honor to help relaunch the PARC Forum. Human beings are social creatures, and it's nice to get together. I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and talking with many of you at the reception later on. It's also a real joy for me to be here because I've just finished writing this book. What you all have done here in your history is so closely connected to so much of what I wrote about in the book. And the future that SRI is now building, as you've been able to read about in recent media coverage, including in the New York Times, which I had nothing to do with, but I was very excited to read. Congratulations on that, is really exciting to see. So I want to start by asking you all to use your imaginations a little bit. I want to ask you to imagine that tomorrow you were going to go to San Francisco Airport and you were going to fly across the country. You can imagine you're flying to Washington, D.C., which in fact tomorrow morning I will be doing to go home. If you want to imagine you're going to see a show in New York or going to the beach in Miami, you heard I'm a basketball fan. If you want to fantasize about seeing Paige Beckers and Caitlin Clark play each other tomorrow night in what should be one of the best basketball games in a long time, you can imagine that you're flying to Cleveland. So as you think about this trip, I want you to think about the very beginning of the trip when you wake up in your house and you have to think about what time you would need to leave your house in order to get to the airport. If you take the airlines literally, you need to get there 2 hours early. Most of us push it just a little bit. So whatever your normal habit is, think about what time you might need to wake up for, say, an 8:30 a.m. flight east. Think about your drive to the airport. Think about your experience at the airport. Think about the flight, and then think about landing wherever you're going and doing the reverse. And then I want you to think about what that trip would have been like 50 years ago. Many of us imagine that we have lived through a period of rapid change and great progress. But when it comes to getting around, that just isn't true. Nearly every aspect of the trip that I just described to you was faster 50 years ago than it is today. You didn't have to get to the airport 2 hours early because you didn't have to take off your shoes or go through the pre-check line or do all that. The traffic here in Silicon Valley was substantially less bad 50 years ago than it is today. This is the most amazing thing. The scheduled flight time from the West Coast to the East Coast was about a half an hour shorter 50 years ago than it is today. Our airlines are not more technologically advanced in ways that have sped the trip, and there is more traffic in the air. So planes don't cross the country as rapidly as they used to when you include everything after you leave the gate until you get to the new gate. And then, of course, you land in New York or Cleveland or wherever you're going, and you have to deal with traffic on that end. Life in terms of getting around our country has slowed down over the last 50 years. That is profoundly different than most of our history. If you have grandparents who grew up in this country or great-grandparents who do, and on my family, I have one side where the great-grandparents did and another side where they were immigrants. But if you have grandparents, think about the scale of change that they lived through. In 1869, the United States completed the Transcontinental Railroad. Almost immediately, passenger trains were running on the Transcontinental Railroad. A trip that had taken weeks or months in the past and often been very dangerous was immediately cut to a week. By 1900, the cross-country journey was cut to a few days. By 1930, you could hopscotch the country on airlines. And in 1959, the first nonstop jet, regular commercial service, flew across the country from LA to New York. Carl Sandburg, the poet, was on that plane. Here's what he said. "You look out of the window at the waves of dark and light clouds, looking like ocean shorelines, and you feel as if you are floating away in this pleasantly moving room, like the basket hanging from the balloon you saw with a visiting circus when you were a boy. You move through rain and come out of it into a clear blue sky with a cloudland below you, and you say to yourself, my, that's pretty to look at." Progress like that inspires poetry. And it is also a kind of progress that has very much stopped in this country. I talked to you about how getting around has slowed down. That is not because we run into any natural limits of how fast human beings can travel in this country. I'm guessing some of you have been to Shanghai, as I have. The train from downtown Shanghai to the Shanghai airport takes 8 minutes. Downtown Shanghai and the Shanghai airport are further apart than Times Square and LaGuardia Airport. I challenge any of you to get from Times Square to LaGuardia Airport in 8 minutes or 18 minutes. You can do it in 28 minutes in the middle of the night, but it's hard to find too many good flights in the middle of the night. I think this is a remarkable indictment of a modern society's ability to make progress. How fast you can move around is a very basic measure of progress. It affects productivity, it affects happiness. One of the least happy things human beings ever do, social science research has shown, is commute. And we have slowed down in that way. I understand that we're sitting here in Silicon Valley. I understand that Silicon Valley is known as a place of rapid change. And certainly there are ways that our society has changed over the last 50 years. Some of them are exciting. I'm carrying a supercomputer in my pocket. I can listen to almost any song I want, or look up almost any article or any sports statistic or just about anything. That has enormous advantages. A couple of my friends are here today. I can take a picture of us together afterwards and then text it to our other old friends who all know each other. But I also think there are significant ways in which our society has stagnated. And I think we don't often pay enough attention to those ways. I've already mentioned transportation. Income and wealth for most Americans, for Americans who lack a college degree, has grown very slowly over the last few decades. Many measures of health have stagnated or even gone in reverse, things like diabetes and obesity. The number of children growing up with two parents has gone in reverse. The number of Americans who say they feel lonely has risen. The number of Americans who suffer chronic pain has risen. And in what I consider to be the most important measure of our society's health, life expectancy, although it has risen less than it has in any similar country. This is the first chart in my book. In 1980, the United States had a normal life expectancy for a rich country. If you look at the chart, we don't look that different from Western Europe or Japan or South Korea or Canada or Australia. But beginning in the early 1980s, life expectancy in this country began to grow very slowly. It particularly began to grow very slowly for people who do not have a four-year college degree. Today, the United States has the lowest life expectancy of any rich country. That has been true for the last 15 years. It's not even particularly close today. We trail Japan and South Korea and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and every country in Western Europe. In a basic way, our society has stagnated. In my book, I try to answer the question of how this has happened. And I point to a few different forces. I talk about political power. I think both of our political parties have abandoned people who lack a college degree in certain ways. I talk about corporate culture, which I think is less patriotic and less communitarian and more self-seeking than it used to be. But I also talk a lot about investment, which embodies what this place, SRI, is about. Not only has our transportation stagnated in certain ways, the share of money that we spend on R&D as a share of our economy, as our GDP, has gone down. We stand out among rich countries as devoting more of our government to older people and less of our government to younger people, which is a way of neglecting the future. If you're over 60 years old in this audience, you are part of the most educated generation in the world. You and other people your age, and like your parents and grandparents, were the most educated generation in the world. If you are younger, you are no longer part of the most educated generation in the world. Other countries have passed us by. We've accumulated a huge national debt, which is a way of mortgaging the future for the present. And although it's not financial, a particularly stark recent example was COVID, in which we clearly deprioritized the interest of young people. We shut down schools in many communities, including many communities near where we are today, for more than a year, while we allowed restaurants and bars to open. That is neglecting the future for the president in a very tangible way. We decided it was safe to go out and drink in bars, but not to educate our children in schools. This makes me sad, both because I love this country, even if that's unfashionable to say today, and because we have such a proud history of investment. Through so much of our future, we have led the world in investment. We've led it through a vibrant private sector, which does most of our investment, but we have also led it by recognizing that there are forms of investment that the private sector won't do when left to its own devices, because it's not clear how that investment will be profitable. Gutenberg didn't get rich from the printing press. It's often very hard to know exactly how an invention's or research's commercial possibilities will translate into profitable possibilities, which is why the government needs to make investments and historically has made investments. Listen to this list. Government-funded research led to the development of penicillin, cortisone, chemotherapy, vaccines, cardiac treatment. In transportation, the government built the air traffic control system and the interstate highway system. Government funding helped develop the satellite, the jet engine, the snowmobile, the microwave oven, And as I don't have to tell you here, the Defense Department built the original version of the internet, or at least Defense Department funding did. As late as 1959, federal agencies financed about 85% of the country's electronics research. The region we are sitting in exists because, in large part, of government funding. Silicon Valley has long captured this country's imagination because it represents the future, and the future, as Carl Sandburg knew, can be tremendously exciting. But we have to shape our future for it to be a great future. The future doesn't just arrive. In order to have a better tomorrow, we have to make better decisions today. We have to be rigorous about thinking about what kind of economy actually delivers a better life for most Americans. We have to be more rigorous than we have been in recent years. I want to end by pointing out tomorrow that I will be getting up very early to leave my hotel here in Palo Alto in order to get to the airport. And I am not happy about that. I am even less happy about all the ways that the United States is not living up to its potential. But I remain confident that we have the ability to forge the better future that we have forged in the past, not just for the kinds of people who are fortunate enough to be in this room tonight, but for all Americans, including Americans who are considerably less fortunate than most of us are. Thank you again for having me here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, David. That was just fascinating, and I'm sure there'll be lots of great questions. In the beginning of a great conversation, I want to remind you that if you have a card or need a card to write a question down, there are people in the two of my colleagues are in the aisles there, and if you sort of raise your hand, they'll come down and either collect a card from you with a question, bring them to me, or they will give you a card and a pencil if you need one.
Thank you. In fact, I used the cards myself. I thought this is great for my questions here. So I loved your summary. In fact, you probably answered half the things I was going to touch on. You brought it through. But I was thinking about travel. So my mom traveled from the Philippines on a boat. It took her a month. So
What year?
In the 60s.
Okay.
Yeah. And then today, as you said, unevenness, right? So I'm flying tomorrow as well. So I got my parking space on my phone to be ready to go there. You can pick where you want to eat. You'll probably Uber or Lyft tomorrow to be able to get there. So it's like we have some advances and others not in terms of things moving forward, like you noted. The thing that jumped out to me in your book is one quote that just, I think is emblazoned in my mind. Education is an investment that can turbocharge every other investment a society makes. And you talked about the levers of power, culture, and investment, and then highlighted the importance of education. It's one, we have many researchers working in that space. Could you elaborate more on that in terms of how you see education, investment being key, and as you started to talk about a little bit about how we have not done enough and others have caught up to where we once led the world?
The United States' history on education is just incredibly proud. It is one of our greatest legacies as a country. We were the first country in many ways to make grade school education, mass grade school education, the norm. Then, thanks to a grassroots movement called the high school movement that began in many small towns. Iowa was a particular center of it, but it happened in many states. We became the first country in the world to have mass high school education. And I think that history is really interesting because there was a debate at the time about whether it actually made sense to send workers to high school. And in Europe, one of the main decisions they made was no. Why does a worker need to go learn algebra? Why does a worker need to read Shakespeare? It's a worker. We're putting them into the factories. They're going to be on a farm. And the United States made a fundamentally different bet. And boy, did we profit from that bet. Our farmers became more productive because they knew algebra. Our factory workers became more productive. We created a larger pool of potential entrepreneurs who could start companies. And so that's basically a century ago. If 13 years, K through 12, was the right amount of mass education a century ago, and you think about how much more technologically complex our society is today, surely 13 years is no longer the right number today. I think it has to be more. And I think it's really important to say that because there is this skepticism about the value of education. To be self-critical, at least of my profession, you hear it from journalists a lot. You read stories, is college overrated? You see university professors and think tank people saying, is college overrated? One of the things that I always like to think about is, do those people think college is overrated for their own kids? Or are they working really hard to make sure their own kids go to good high schools and get into good colleges? And so I think education's enormously valuable by any measure you look at. The second message, and we need to make it broadly available, the second message I would add is we also have to create good paying jobs and decent, dignified lives for people who aren't going to get a four-year college degree. And those are not contradictory ideas, even if they're two sides. We have to make it possible for everyone to go to college, whether they're going to get a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree. And we have to make sure that college isn't the only route to a good life in the United States.
Right, because as you point out with farmers and so much of society before transitioning, there are all these transitions, industrial revolution, or things with the knowledge economy today, where we have to think about what you just said. It makes me wonder, though, over time, will we eventually be going to school for 20 years, 25, or maybe it's really sort of the notion of lifelong learning, right? In a different,
That's a
once
fair
you have the
question.
foundation.
No, I think that's a really fair question, right? It can't be the case that in 2800 the year, people are going to be going to school until they're 50. And so I do think it's important that we also rethink parts of school. I don't think we're yet at a kind of limit where it makes, I do really think we want most people going to college.
Right.
And I don't mean that 17 years is the right number. I'm not saying the aspiration should be to get everyone a bachelor's degree, but I do think we want most people getting a post-high school degree. And also we should think about what we're doing in high school today that doesn't work that well. I mean, I think if you look at the numbers, I particularly worry. Obviously, writ large in society, gender inequality is a huge problem in terms of the many ways that sexism limits the opportunities of women. There is something particular about school today that isn't working for boys, and particularly blue-collar boys. And I think we should be thinking about that as part of all this.
And in fact, in your book, you talk about how so much of the emphasis, because of education, has been sort of college-educated community, and the working class, often from all sectors, is not heard in the same way. And I think that touches on that. We also mentioned about how college education may be overemphasized at times, but also needed. But it seems like pre-K is maybe underappreciated.
Oh my goodness. So, I mean, we don't have public pre-K, right? I mean, we have it in some localities, and that's really good, and that's expanded. But if you look at any piece of research, it is clear that as a society, we have an enormous interest in providing education to, let's start at age 2 or 3, right? I understand that in different communities, in some communities, people want to keep their kids home for longer, and I think we should absolutely support that. But certainly when you're talking about 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, there need to be options for early education. And as a society, we've basically said, now you're on your own. Which is incredibly damaging to us, because if you look at lifelong earnings, if you look at the kind of taxes that people will pay back into society, if you look at their likelihood of committing crime, of ending up needing government benefits, pre-K is an investment that more than pays for itself. And we almost accept it as normal that as a society, we don't invest in pre-K. That's one of the reasons why other countries have passed us by in total educational attainment. Because if you send a kid from a relatively low income background to preschool, that kid is much more likely to end up being a college graduate.
Yeah, your kids ready to learn.
Yeah.
Coming in.
Yeah.
And we're talking about the American dream. And in your intro, you're commenting on basically that phrase, in some ways being attributed to the historian, James Adams, and in his book about the epic of America. And I love the way you captured sort of the essence of what he was saying, that the American dream is about the ability of people to rise above the circumstances of their birth. And as you talk about the different metrics, not just wealth, but health and all the other things that you mentioned a moment ago, and we've reached a point of stagnation in this country. But you also make the interesting point that one of the exceptions to that are immigrants.
Yes.
As a group. I mean, we both share that background in terms of our histories and our families. So why do you think that is true for that group? And how do we as a society need to think about that, what we can learn, and how that helps move the country forward? in terms of a healthy view of both the risk, the competition, the benefits
I mean,
of immigration.
the amazing thing is we all share that background, right? Almost by definition, however many generations it was. So I think the point you made is really important, and there's some really great research in a book called Streets of Gold by an economist here at Stanford and an economist at Princeton, in which it's an example of big data. They collected census records, they collected tax records, they collected all this research, and they tried to look at how immigrants from recent generations, how their trajectory compares to immigrants from the late 19th and early 20th century, which is when a significant portion of my family came over. And I think there's a lot of skepticism that today's immigrants are doing as well. They face some challenges that past immigrants didn't. But actually, the pace of progress for recent immigrants is remarkably similar to the pace of progress from past immigrants. By some measures, like intermarriage, they're actually they're assimilating and kind of rising the ladder even faster. Overall, it's very similar. The dominant experience is that the immigrant herself or himself remains poor, but that their children make very rapid progress. And within just a couple of generations, that family looks like an average American. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. Immigrants are not a random selection of other countries' populations. Immigrants are also much more willing to move toward places in the United States that have more opportunity. So Houston is an example of an economy that's been booming for decades. I think Americans from places with less, native-born Americans with places from less opportunity, often for good reason, haven't been wanting to move to places like Houston because it's hot, because they're still around their family. And actually, it's funny, there are people from
My son's in Houston, so
there are people from many parts of the world. Many parts of the world are hotter than the United States, and they're not actually turned away by Houston's heat. It's interesting. So there are many reasons that we're going to do it. The thing that one of the things I was actually a little bit anxious about how this part of my book would be received, and I've been very grateful that the discussion I've heard about it has been the kind of debate that I think we should have, which is honest, vigorous, but respectful debate, as I've been talking about on college campuses. I think there's this desire among many people on the political left and the pro-business right to take all of the good facts I just said and say, and thus immigration is only a good, it's a free lunch, we should all just want more immigration. But I do think immigration has costs as well as benefits. Mm-hmm. I think it does often provide more labor competition for existing workers. I think we're making a mistake when we tell workers, no, you naive people, don't worry about immigrants coming. I mean, think about doctors. Doctors recognize that immigrants provide competition for their jobs. It's why they make it so hard for immigrants to come here and immediately practice medicine. You basically have to do a residency in this country. There's no good economic reason for that. It's a way of doctors shielding themselves from wage competition from immigrants. And so I really think that instead of just saying immigration is good, thus more of it is always better, we should be respectful of people who are uncomfortable with levels of immigration. We should look around the world and realize that many countries like Japan and South Korea have much lower levels of immigration than we do. Other countries in Europe have had real political turmoil over high levels of immigration. Immigration is great, we need it, but it isn't simply the case that because it's great, we should have as much as possible and imagine that it is a free lunch. Very few things are a free lunch.
Yeah, and that's true, and sort of both sides, and certainly for this country has been part of our secret sauce. We think about the melting pot, and even SRI, we were once seeing how many different countries our employees originally from. It's over 80, and you see that certainly in a lot of the science fields and things of that fashion. But before we take our first question from the audience, one of the things I love about your book is how you tell the story about economics, which is complex. The American dream, where was it, what caused it, how do we lose it? How do we get it back? But also through the lens of people and lots of interesting individuals throughout the book. I think of Grace Hopper, one who, today maybe we take it for granted that women can have a big impact, not only being allowed to teach at a university or work on math and things of that fashion, but not so much then, or even Paul Hoffman. What's the role of business and business leaders in terms of helping think about where we chart a course? I don't know if you want to pick one of them or someone else that's a favorite of yours, maybe the tell a little bit more about their story, and then we'll jump to Mike for a
Those are
question.
two great ones here. Thank you. I mean, the thing that I had so much fun writing this book was learning about these figures. And it's a mix of people who are relatively unfamiliar. I would say Grace Hopper and Paul Hoffman to most Americans are unfamiliar.
Right.
Grace Hopper was the pioneering computer scientist, as some of you may know. And I tell the story of she helped develop one of the first computers really ever at Harvard during World War II. She also, in the kind of lesson of nothing is actually new, I assume many of you are familiar with the New York Times Needle. Many of you probably hate the New York Times Needle because it's how you learned results of elections that you may not have been happy about. And I helped invent the New York Times Needle. I don't have the mathematical skills to invent it, but I helped come up with the concept that people who do have higher mathematical skills than I do use to invent it. And we were very excited about how path-breaking this was. Well, if you've been watching CBS News in 1952 on election night, you would have seen something that was the exact same thing as the New York Times Needle that Grace Hopper and her team did. They had regionally adjusted election returns that told them very quickly that Dwight Eisenhower was going to beat Adlai Stevenson for the presidency. And so it gives you a kind of perspective and humility about it. Paul Hoffman was the CEO of Studebaker, and I think he's a really relevant figure for corporate America today. He was conservative. He really didn't like FDR. He voted against him 4 times. He tried to help the Republicans running against him win. But he also was deeply concerned that the version of American capitalism they'd adopted in the 20s and 30s was undermining itself. And he said, look, we have to come up with a version of capitalism that actually delivers the goods to the American people, or we're going to be at risk of people saying, well, let's try fascism or communism, as was being tried in Europe. And Paul Hoffman really helped lead this movement of corporate leaders who said, hey, if we want to keep this system that we all have benefited from so much, we have to think about what kind of results it delivers for ordinary people. A last thing, I realized as I wrote the book, and in some ways my favorite character is A. Philip Randolph, the incredible civil rights leader, because if he never got down about the odds that faced him, boy, we should not get down about the odds that face us today. But I realized that I came to like my character so much that sometimes maybe I came to like him too much when I came home one night and said to my wife, you know, I think Richard Nixon might be underrated. I don't really mean that, but Richard Nixon's economic ideas aren't actually that terrible.
So in your acknowledgments, you talk about your wife being your editor and one who was both optimistic but very candid and frank.
Yeah.
So when you said that, what was her comment?
I think her comment was keep writing.
So in terms of keeping on, Mike, you want to read to us the first question?
Sure. There's 2 questions that are on the same theme. I'll read them both. The vast majority of the world-changing technology you mentioned, highways, satellites, jet engines, even the microwave, were a direct result of military funding, not private investments. And then a similar question observes that President Obama recently chided Elon Musk's spending to go to Mars, saying, I would invest instead in fixing problems on Earth. So both of these ask the same question. What are your thoughts about directing private investment versus public investment in R&D?
So I think the point about the military is a really important point. And thank you to whoever made it. I think I mentioned the debt during my remarks, and the debt is a real problem. And I think sometimes people think, well, one of the ways we should fix the debt is by spending less on the military. And I don't think that's right. I do think we should demand the military be more efficient, and there's huge amounts of waste and pork and self-dealing, and Dwight Eisenhower called it the military-industrial complex. And we should be more aggressive about that. There's a proud history of that. Harry Truman became president because of the attention he got as a senator who basically led hearings into waste in the military during World War II. So it's perfectly patriotic to question it. But I think there are 2 reasons why we actually should welcome really robust spending on the military. One is that I think we face a very threatening world right now. I think that's become obvious because of Ukraine. But anti-democratic forces around the world, and we can talk about anti-democratic forces in this country, but anti-democratic forces around the world are on the march. And I don't want to live in a world where Russia or China have more influence and democratic nations like the United States and Japan and Western Europe have less influence. I don't think that's a very good world to live in. And so I do think we need a strong military in order to try to prevent, to make other countries afraid to do what Russia has done in Ukraine. But then there's a second thing, which is the military spending actually can have enormous spillover benefits in all the ways that Mike just mentioned. And so military spending in a way that isn't the case with some other forms of government spending can actually help pay for itself in ways that, that say the mortgage interest deduction, which I benefit from, doesn't help pay for itself. In terms of going to Mars, I actually think, looking for ways to go to Mars can be the kind of thing that does have spillover benefits. But I also don't think it's the kind of thing that we just want to entrust to a few billionaires. I think we're going to get a better version of going to Mars if it's society prioritizing what we actually need.
Yeah, and others are investing in education and cures for disease and things like that, right? But I think if we can increase that, like you mentioned, we really create the foundation for future growth. Mike?
Sure. How can we shape AI to bridge the gaps between the college educated and the rest?
So I don't know if the person who asked that question has seen the research by David Autor. He's an MIT economist. My friend Steve Lohr at the New York Times, who's written a lot about Silicon Valley, just had a piece in the Times about David Autor. I recommend it to all of you. David Autor is known for describing in unsparing terms how our modern economy has hurt blue collar and working class people. He's written at great length about just how many Americans have lost their jobs because of global trade. He helped coin the phrase the China shock. He's talked about just how hard it's been on many workers. He's optimistic about AI. He basically thinks AI has the potential to help lower income workers essentially take their skills and sort of build them up, right? If you imagine someone who is really good at doing manicures, but doesn't speak English, or doesn't have much of a background in writing, it becomes much easier for that person to advertise in her or his community. That's a very small stylized example, but you can kind of imagine various versions of that. Other people are skeptical of that argument, and they think that AI is going to end up hurting workers instead. I don't know the answer. I do think that the social media lessons of the last 15 years should make us extremely skeptical that we will get the outcomes that we want as a society without regulation. We have largely allowed social media to go unregulated. And I do think for all of its benefits, mobile technology and the phone and social media have really meaningfully contributed to a lot of our problems in society. I mean, here's a way to think about it. Nothing has changed our lives in most of our living lives as much as the phone has, right? Nothing, our daily experiences, the phone has changed it more than anything. So if it actually were good for mental health, if it actually reduced political polarization, if it actually improved the quality of our political dialogue, you sure would think that we would see evidence of that having happened in 15 years. And instead, what we see is over the same period that we've all become addicted to our phones, teen mental health has declined, loneliness has increased, and political polarization has risen. I mean, some of these problems are so profound that people are worried that children aren't having enough sex today, which through most of history would be a very bizarre worry for people to have. But kids are spending so much time alone inside their bedrooms that they're just not socializing with each other and doing the things that comes with socializing with each other. And so to me, the great lesson of the last 15 years has been whatever the benefits and downsides of AI, I don't think the private sector is naturally going to deliver a beautiful future.
And some of those are causal, some are correlation in terms of these impacts and changes, but you're right in terms of, screen time and things like fashion, and that combined with the pandemic, you see that impact on kids, like you said, mental health and things like fashion. I think that's where the research community, along with sort of the needs of guardrails, even from the regulatory side, as you know, can have a really big role, because there are things that can be built in to put in the guardrails, explainability, and the frameworks that allow one to have large language models be helpful. On the productivity side, it's, I think of when I was a grad student at Stanford, coding and assembly, And later on, you have languages and then graphical user interfaces and graphical programming. And now where you can say to your large language model, write me a code in Python that does this, right? And it's just amazing the productivity that's possible. And I think it's really about how we use that.
I just had an experience this myself. I probably should be embarrassed to admit I use Excel, but I use Excel. And I was trying to figure out how to do something. And I was asking a colleague of mine, do I need to try to do this in R? And he said, no, you can do it in Excel. I said, I don't know how. And he said, well, just ask AI how to do it. And I've actually found some of the AI stuff to be surprisingly unimpressive. Like, I think it's terrible at writing so far. I think it doesn't have recent information because it's not basically allowed to look for recent information. But this is one thing that, like, basically it taught me how to do it in Excel in about 5 minutes. And it probably saved me 3 hours.
Right. And also it's where it is today. Think about the first calculator computer or things that fashion, right?
Absolutely.
Well, what's interesting, I was talking to a colleague who's a professor at the University of the East Coast, and he said as he's teaching students to use tools like this, he's finding in many cases the English major is a better programmer than the engineer. I go, how could that be? He goes, well, because the engineer will look at the code and spend all their time on the code, whereas the English major often knows how to prompt it and ask the right questions of what it'll produce. But Mike?
Good lesson. Don't give your kids a hard time if they're majoring in humanities. That's the lesson.
Well, here's a question for our kids. For Gen Z, what historical era of the US would be the most helpful to learn from in order to navigate the future, especially with the rate of change presented by technology?
I think it's important to keep in mind that technological change is not new. So I actually think that as I was arguing, in some ways, I think some things have changed less over the last 50 years. My colleague Ross Douthat has made a version of this point. You know, when I'm 51, when I think of how much certain aspects of life have changed, they've changed a lot less than they did for my grandparents in their first 51 years of life. I mean, they were born in 1918 and 1923. So I think it's okay to look to other areas and eras and just sort of be clear about the technological change in those eras. It may not always even feel like technological change at the time. I mean, a printed newspaper is a version of technological change, right?
Right.
And so it's a really interesting question. I do think I've mentioned the notion that I think there is something of a global competition right now between roughly liberal democracies and authoritarian states. And I do think it is useful to look back at the Cold War and think about both what were the terrible aspects of the Cold War in this country, the Red Scare, which often manifested itself particularly through anti-Semitism and accusing Jews of not being loyal to this country. And it is easy to imagine today how something similar could happen to Chinese Americans or Asian Americans more broadly.
Japanese before. Right?
Japanese Americans before that. And yet the Cold War also had some really good qualities to it. When we sit around lamenting why is it that Republicans and Democrats can't compromise today? Well, one of the reasons they compromised in the past was the Cold War. They didn't view each other as the enemy because they understood there was actually an enemy. And I know enemy is a strong word, but I think when you think about what some of the authoritarian regimes in the world want to do, I don't think enemy is too strong a word. And so looking back to previous periods where our basic notion of what a society should look like was being challenged severely around the world, and thinking about how we messed up in this country and how we might avoid that, and also what are some of the things that we can recapture, I think is worth doing. It is not an accident. Joe Biden he's made mistakes, but Joe Biden has been successful at passing bipartisan legislation, more successful than I expected and most people expected, in part because people saw this legislation as contributing to the United States' efforts to compete with China, both the semiconductor legislation and the bipartisan and the infrastructure legislation, which are examples of investing in the future. And so I think it's worth kind of looking back to that and thinking about what actually are some ways in which this very frightening global competition might have some domestic benefits.
Looking back on the whole creation of NASA, ARPA, and the others, right?
Yeah.
In recent years, I mean, it has been almost bipartisan to think about investing in science and R&D and things of that fashion. And now less so, and science sometimes for some can be a bad word, where that used to be the gold standard, how we provided information that our decision makers could figure out what to do with it in terms of policy. What do you think we need to do to get back to that, where as a society we see that as truly important, right?
See
Science and investment in R&D.
So I think on R&D, I think it's important that people see benefits of R&D, right? That you can see kind of tangible benefits and that they flow broadly to the population. As you could tell, as much as I love my own phone, I'm pretty negative about aspects of mobile phones and social media. And I think if we say to Americans, you should support R&D because look at all this wonderful technology, and many of them look around and a lot of their day-to-day lives aren't better. And then you have the phone, which has huge advantages, but also I think some pretty significant disadvantages. I understand why Americans may be less excited about R&D than they used to be. I think we have to show people that it delivers the goods. I think on science, I think that, look, the reality is that science is practiced largely by people from one of our two political tribes. The same is true of many people who work for journalistic organizations, right? They are college graduates who work in major metropolitan areas like San Francisco, New York, Washington, and Boston. Those are overwhelmingly blue areas. And I think the same is true about a lot of science. And I think COVID was important in this way because I think a lot of science writ large overreached. And I think it's important for science to have humility in order to get trust from people. And so I think we diminish people's trust in science when we pretend that science is almost like a god, right? Trust the science, listen to the science, I believe in the science. Well, the science says lots of different things. Did the science say schools should be open or schools should be closed? At the time, lots of people said science says schools should be closed. Well, actually, in retrospect, it turns out I think science said schools should have been open.
Yeah,
and I think
little kids.
And I think there are versions of lots of that, right? I mean, the reality around COVID has barely changed since late 2021, right? Paxlovid is better than it was, but our behavior has changed enormously. Right? We wouldn't be sitting here in 2021. And so I do think it's important for scientists and those of us who are pro-science to reflect on the ways that science can sometimes seem arrogant to people and can sometimes seem as if it's not listening to people. I think part of restoring trust in science is being willing to listen and be willing to be humble.
I love that phrasing about humility. I remember I was actually leading a study on COVID in the Northeast to look at a response to that. And one of the things we wrote in our report, because this was like in the first months of the pandemic, right? When we didn't know about, she'd use a hairdryer in a salon, let alone eat in a bar or go to school, is we said, this pandemic will give everyone a chance to be wrong.
Yes.
In terms of, what they expected and things of that fashion. But I think that humility in our charge to scientists is get the data right. Put that out there, even if it seems to lead in a direction that you may not personally like, but allow that conversation back and forth around that information.
And acknowledge that there are trade-offs.
Yes.
Right? I mean, I was talking about this before about immigration. Very few things in life come without trade-offs, right? And so is it the case that if we return to work or reopen schools, we would create more risk of COVID spread? Yes. Is it the case that by shutting down human interaction, we have very large other costs? Yes. And it's not science, capital S's job to resolve that debate. It's science's job to help us understand those trade-offs and then allow our democratic system to make those trade-offs. And as you said, realize that we're all going to be wrong at some times. I mean, I became known somewhat in public for questioning some of the arguments about COVID precautions. And she's now 15. I have a 15-year-old daughter. You'll be shocked to hear she likes to make fun of me. And so her favorite photo during COVID is a photo of me outdoors at a rest stop, double masked. Now, in retrospect, we know that I probably didn't need a mask at all outdoors,
Outdoors, yeah.
let alone two, right? And so it's not like anyone got everything right during COVID. And it's not like science gets everything right. It's science's job. Science is a process. It's its job to make us more intelligent and to acknowledge uncertainty and trade-offs. And as you said, embrace humility.
And gives us the opportunity to see what our options are there. Mike, you have another question?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. I can either ask it or I can hand it back to you.
You can ask it, and I think people won't mind if we stay an extra minute.
Sure.
I have one last question.
Okay, that's
also
fine.
for our-
So this is a fascinating question for a number of reasons. It says, I'm a 5th generation Palo Alto. That's the first Palo Alton. That's the first very fascinating part of it. My grandmother rode trolleys connected from San Francisco, Palo Alto, San Jose, Los Angeles. And Goodyear and Ford helped pay for the trolleys and to help pay for the roads and pave them over. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread the question. The question is, how can we accelerate transportation now? And if I can just extend the question a little bit to a separate, a different question is, how can we encourage more private investment in some of these various kinds of societal needs?
So the Ford example is an example that we shouldn't trust Ford to create our transportation future. We should trust Ford to be really good at making Fords. But that may not be the same thing as creating the kind of transportation future that we want. And so I think part of it is recognizing that as a society, we have to make decisions about what's good for us. And then I think part of it is, there's this increasing interest in what some people have described as supply side progressivism. Matt Iglesias, Derek Thompson, my colleague Ezra Klein have talked about a lot of this stuff. It's related to ideas of YIMBYism, right? And building more. And I do think it's really important as we think about transportation that if we're going to build transportation networks that work, there are going to be trade-offs there too, right? We can't spend 5-10 years doing environmental review on transportation projects. We have to make faster decisions. We have to accept the fact that great transportation projects cost money, have downsides, often require getting rid of some things that now exist. Maybe the trade-offs aren't worth it sometimes, but other times they are. I highly recommend a recent podcast called The Big Dig. That's available wherever you get your podcasts, as they say. And it was done by GBH, which is one of the public television stations in Boston. And I think the person who did it is 35 years old. And he said, I did it because all I grew up hearing was how horrible the Big Dig was, how inefficient it was, how expensive it was, how miserable it was. And now I live in Boston and walk around and I love the Big Dig. It transformed this city. It's beautiful. Getting around is nicer. And I wanted to make a podcast that tried to connect those two things. And he uses it as an allegory for why we as Americans really struggle to do big projects anymore. Some of it is that we give too much sway to private companies, but some of it is that we can't get out of our own way and we can't be bold enough in order to kind of do big things. And then to the second part of Mike's question, private companies have a huge role in all of this. I mean, the dominant experience is that the government often needs to do the initial investments, and then we really just don't need the government that much. When you go through the incredibly heroic list of things that SRI has funded, most of those things are not today sitting in government agencies.
No,
right?
No.
We then let the private sector work its innovative.
They can scale it, deliver it.
They can scale it, deliver it. They can bring down the price. We let it work its innovative magic. We need the government often to fund the early research, and then depending what it is, to regulate it in a way that makes sure that it's actually providing benefits for us. And yes, there are risks of overregulation. We should not have the government setting the price on every airline route the way we used to. We should have the government figuring out how we can have a more efficient air traffic system and cracking down on some of the concentration in the airline industry.
Yeah, because at the early stage, it's hard to know what that technology is good for.
Yes.
You want to think about what it could. You need both sort of the application need driven as well as just the curiosity, both together. And so at that point, you could never, I mean, in a company where I used to run research, you would always lose in terms of asking for investment to someone who had asked for investment in an area the company knew. Because they knew the model, they could show, you give me this many million, I can turn it into this return over this period of time in an assured fashion. Now that business could disappear after time, but in the near term, you could see that. You talk about something new, there's so much uncertainty on it. And it's also not the role, as you said, of the companies necessarily to do things simply for the general public good, where other people would benefit from. And so that really, I think, is a strong point about investment.
You reminded me of a quote from Thomas Watson Jr. Talking about the personal computer and his original attitude for it. It didn't move me at all. I couldn't see this gigantic, costly, unreliable device as a piece of business equipment. That's the chairman of IBM, right? And that's because they had a punch card business, which of course the computer threatened. And they were more focused on the punch card business than the computer.
Right. And in fact, that was also where you made the point that it was the investment in terms of things for national defense that drove them to go do something in that space that then became what it contributed to the rest.
Yeah, it was IBM basically became the IBM we know today by winning the contract to build the radar system in Alaska to make sure the Soviets weren't going to attack us over Alaska.
So I want to come in terms of the end, thinking about the title of the book. Ours was The Shining Future. And again, many things stood out in your book in the conclusions. I was thinking about that as we think about the polarization, the fragmentation, our inability to work together. You had two really key thoughts in my mind. One was how you talked about having respect for the opposing view. And you showed it in the book how you wrote, but also you said it for yourself. And then secondly, that there's going to be a need for uncomfortable compromises. So what would be sort of words to the audience and maybe more broadly in terms of what do we need to do to get back to ours and to flip the tense of the verb from past being was to present being is?
Yeah. I love the title of the book, but if the fully accurate, I didn't come up with it. The fully accurate title would be Ours Was the Shining Future and Can Be Again. That's not quite as pithy. So that is not the title of the book. But the conclusion is really, as you just nicely captured, is really and can be again. So I think that I obviously don't know the politics of this audience, but I know the politics of this region. And I think it is important to recognize that progressive movements writ large are, and the Democratic Party, have played a vital role in creating the kind of more inclusive economy that I talk about in the book. I could do something similar about the Republican Party, but I'm going to focus this on the Democratic Party, given the political hue of the region that I'm sitting in right now. And so I really think we need a healthy progressive movement and a healthy Democratic Party to do things like fight for investment in scientific research and make sure we have an inclusive economy. And I worry very much that today's left and today's Democratic Party have fallen down on the things that you just listed, which is being respectful of the other side and willing to compromise and willing to listen. I think it is important, if you are a progressive, to reflect on the fact that even though the Democratic Party and the progressive movement views itself as the defenders of vulnerable people increasingly in this country look at the Democratic Party and the left and say, no, thank you, I'm not interested. And for a long time, Democrats said, well, that's because they're ignorant. It's because they don't know their own economic interests. It's because they're racist. And it is certainly the truth that the Republican Party has used racism as a really important and odious political tool in recent decades. But it is not true that the only reason that working class people might sour on the Democratic Party or the left is because of ignorance or because of racism or because of irrationality. And I think it's really important, as both parties think about what a healthier United States might look like, to think about how to win over people and be respectful of people with whom you might disagree. The Democratic Party is now losing not only working class whites, but in the last 5 years has lost significant numbers of working class Latinos, working class Black Americans, and working class Asian Americans. And I end my book on an uplifting note, more than a note, multiple notes. And one of the things that I highlight is the incredible, inspiring success of the gay rights movement, which we now call the LGBT in this country. And I ask people to think about how did the gay rights movement achieve such phenomenal, wonderful success? It's changed the lives, I assume, of people all of us know in this room, if it hasn't changed our own lives personally. It's restructured our families in wonderful ways. And the way the gay rights movement achieved such rapid success was not by trying to make people whom it had already persuaded feel good about themselves and disdain people who didn't agree with them. They did it by trying to win over people who didn't yet agree with them by respecting those people. So it said, let us join the military. The military is not exactly a shining liberal institution in America, right? It said, let us too fight for this country. It was an argument that was designed to win over people who weren't already won over. And then the gay rights movement said, let us get married. Another fundamentally conservative institution. And much more rapidly than people ever imagined, the gay rights movement achieved success. And I worry that both parts of our political spectrum, clearly the Trumpist Republican Party, with its affinity for authoritarian politics and its disrespect of democracy, and our left and the Democratic Party, which has decided so many issues are beyond the pale of compromise, and that if you don't agree with us, you're simply wrong. I worry that both halves have essentially sent the message that we're not willing to compromise, we're not willing to listen, we're not willing to respect people who already agree with us. And I'll leave you with the prediction: the party that figures out how to be more respectful of people that don't already agree with them is the party that's likely to win in the end, because that's how you win in a democracy. And we need our democracy to function better to achieve all of the economic goals that we have been talking about here today, like technological progress that produces prosperity and really good lives for really large numbers of people.
No, thank you. And as you said in your book, that no other system other than capitalism has been shown to raise, but it has to be not just run amok.
Yes.
Democratic capitalism. So please join me in thanking our guests. We'll meet you upstairs after. Thank you.